Hello YouTube, this is Umos03. So now we're on to lesson 15 of the Python curriculum, where I'm essentially demonstrating my knowledge and my advice for writing code in Python to the YouTube community. And so whether or not you're trying to land your next software engineering job at Facebook, or if you just want to have a new hobby, you just want to learn how to code because all your friends know how to do it and you want to get on board, these videos are for you. So anyway, in the last two videos, we've been talking about functions. And so in lesson 13, we sort of introduced the concept of a function. And we said basically a function is a modular segment of code that basically achieves a particular task, or maybe it returns a particular value. And we can use functions, we can use the results of functions and the outputs of functions in our code, in our main script, in order to increase functionality and in order to make our programs a little bit more robust and clean and compact. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. So we can go ahead and come up with a sample function, right, which is going to accept two inputs, A and C. Okay, and then basically what it's going to do is it's going to print basically A plus C. Okay, let's do A plus 2 times C. Okay, so let's think about what this function does. Okay, so this function accepts two inputs and prints the result of the first input plus, plus, right? So are we talking about adding or concatenating, right? That depends on the context of the problem, right? So plus the second input, okay? And we could try this with a couple of examples. We would be able to predict what would happen if we go ahead and say sample function of 10 and 12, right? This would go ahead and print 10 plus 2 times 12, which is 34. So now if you go ahead and run it, indeed, you should see 34 printed on the console. What if we had gone ahead and done two string arguments? So what if we had done art and ist? Okay, so now if you go ahead and run main.py, the executable Python file, you get art ist, right? Because it basically took two representations of ist, concatenated them together, and then added that result to art. So it's art ist, right? To get art is to get that artist ist. Okay, so that's basically what's going on here, right? But then we said that it's a problem if you have a mixture of an int and a string, right? So then if you say for and then the word string, and then you go ahead and print it, there's an issue, right? So we basically remember that we say A plus B is concatenation for two strings, okay? Addition for two ints slash floats, and undefined for any other combination. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you. And then A times B, right, is multiple concatenation for a string and an int, multiplication for two ints floats, and undefined for any other combination. So hopefully that makes sense to you. We've already seen examples of that. But basically the lesson here is that inputs to a function have arbitrary data types, okay? But they must make sense within the context of how the function is defined. So we saw an example of that in the previous video, right? What if we say define, what if we say basically get second element, right? I think we did a similar example in the other, in the previous video, right? But basically what you would have to do here is you would basically say something like, you could make u an irrelevant variable. Okay, so here u will be an irrelevant variable. Okay, so basically what you're going to do is you could say something like print t of 1. Okay, so then basically this would just print the second element in t. So here the assumption to make is that t is an iterable. Okay, so basically it's a type of list. Okay, because if you said basically get second element of 434, and then basically, the word rat, then that would be okay, right? This function doesn't depend on you, so it basically makes no difference whatsoever what the data type of your second input is, right? But then what if your first argument was not an iterable? Okay, it can, and this works for strings too, right? Because remember, you have to remember a string is a list of characters, right? So you can access the characters in a string by referring to their index positions, right? So water, the word water is an iterable, okay? And so you would be able to print the A there because that's the second letter that shows up. But what if you just had a float? What if you had 5.6 plus 2.0? So now if you go ahead and run it, there's going to be a runtime error. It says that float, a t has to be an iterable here. That's basically the implication if you say t of 1. Okay, what if you said basically print t equals false, right? So now what is the implication now? The implication is that t is a Boolean, okay? So t is a true false expression, okay? So basically the argument that you pass into a function has to make sense within the context of the function. So hopefully that makes sense to you, right? So then hopefully that makes sense to you. So I think we already wrote that. We also talked about the difference between a print and return. Okay, so basically a function that prints something does not return anything. It does not return anything, okay? It is essentially a command which can print or maybe change the value of a variable, okay? And so this is basically called a void method, okay? And so if you look for an example of a void method, sample function of A and C is a void method because it literally prints something. We don't set the result of sample function equal to something, right? It's not A plus 2 times C that sample function is really returning. It's printing that result, and it does that in and of itself, okay? But if you go ahead and scroll down, we could go ahead and make a function that just returns a number. So give me 2 of int x, okay? And then this is just going to say return 2, okay? And so that would be basically, I'm just going to, sorry, not of int x, just x. I was thinking Java there for a second. So now this is an example of a return method, okay? So a function that returns something can be assigned to a variable, you know, or its result can be printed, okay? But that would require you to write the word print, okay? Because the function just returns a value rather than actually printing something, okay? So basically here you would have to say print of give me 2 of 10, okay? And then this is another example of a constant function where it's just going to return 2 every time, right? And we still have this issue with trying to get an element from a float. So let's go ahead and delete that command, and then we're going to run it. And indeed, we get that 2 there, right? So that's no issue. And then we also said you can assign that to a variable. So what if you said give me 2 of 10 plus give me 2 of 5, okay? And then what if you said b minus equals give me 2 of b, okay? And so then if you say print of b, well, this would basically be b equals 2 plus 2, and then take b's current value and subtract 2. So here you would just get that 2 there. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And those are some examples of the difference between a function that prints something on its own, and in which case you would just call it, you know, with whatever inputs you need to feed into it, or if you have a function that just returns something. So you set the output of the function equal to something, but then you have to actually remember to go one extra step and actually print it to the console. Okay, so that was one of the things we were talking about in the previous video. We also said that a function can be an input to a function. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by that. What we're going to do is we're going to come up with 2 main functions. So we're going to say main function 1 of x, okay, and then we're going to say basically this function would have the effect of returning 2 larger than that number. And then you could also have main function 2 of x, in which case that would return 2 times the number, x times 2, okay? And so you can see a Python enhancement proposal. I don't know if you saw that that line was underlined. This line was underlined, it had a little gray thing, but basically it's good etiquette to try to have 2 lines that separate functions. So before and after functions, you should go ahead and separate them with 2 lines of space. And then remember, one of the things we've also said is that you need to define a function before you can call it. That's a difference between Java and Python. So now what you could do is you could say, you could come up with another function called functions of functions. And so what it needs to do, it needs to accept a particular function to call and an input to feed into that function. And then what you would do is you would simply just say return f of x. Okay, so now you could go ahead and say print and then function of functions, and then you would just specify which of these functions you wanted to use, right? This literally just has the effect of running f with the input x. So now if you go ahead and say main function 1, all you do is write that function name right there. You don't need to say of x or anything. You just say main function 1, and then you can call it with 10. And then it would go ahead and do that, right? So it's basically you get that 12 there, but then if you go ahead and run main function 2 with the input 10, you get 20 instead. Okay, what if you had changed this so that function of functions, instead of returning f of x, it returns f of x plus 1? Well, now what's going to happen? Now it's going to run main function 2, and it's going to pass in 10, right? But then this would do main function 2 of 11. Okay, so this would actually print 22. So hopefully you can keep up with the logic and you can understand what's going on with that, okay? What if you iterated? So what if you did f of x? Okay, so now let's think about what happens here. So now if you run function of functions with main function 2 and the input 10, sorry, let me zoom back out a little bit. We want to have that be the right size. Shoot. Okay, hopefully that's the right size. I don't know if that's exactly what it used to be, but main function 2 and 10, right? So this would do main function 2 of main function 2 of 10. Well, what's main function 2 of 10? It's 20. Okay, so therefore, what's main function 2 of 20? It's 40. And so 40 is what's printed to the console. So hopefully that makes some intuitive sense to you. Okay. We can also think about a function that would both print and return something, right? And so what you can actually do, what we have been drawing a distinction between functions that print something and functions that return something. Indeed, we can have a function which prints a value and returns an output, So let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to say something like define new function of x and y, okay? And then what it's going to do is it's going to print x times y, but it's going to return x minus y. So let's think about what this function does. Okay, so every call to the function, so for example, if you say a equals new function of 2 and 3, basically just making that variable assignment, calling the function means, means that this line will be printed. Every time you make a call to new function, it's going to print that line, even if you're just assigning a variable. You don't even have to print the result of new function to see x times y be printed. But I'm going to show you what I mean by that in a second. So now what we're going to do is basically the result or output of new function is x minus y. So let's see the difference here. What we're going to do is we're going to say b equals new function of 10 and 4, and then we're going to say print of b. So this is going to actually print two things. As a result of line 66, as a result of assigning new function of 10 and 4 to b, basically by doing this function call, it does two things. It assigns b, it basically prints 10 times 4, and it assigns b to 6. So this line of code prints 10 times 4 and assigns b to the value 10 minus 4, okay? And then this line of code prints the value of b, which is 6. Okay, so now you should see 40 and 6 printed on the console, and it's giving us some more Python enhancement proposal suggestions. Remember that there's usually a space between the hashtag and the start of your comments. So now you can go ahead and run main.py, and you get the 40 and the 6, right? And I guess we don't want to get confused with other examples that we were doing. I always have to remember to clear some of the previous print statements from other examples that we've done previously. I don't want you guys to get confused. So let's just clear all that, and then we can run main.py, and indeed we get the 40 and the 6, okay? So there is a distinction to be drawn between methods that print and methods that return, but theoretically you could have a function that does both. What if you go ahead and say x equals new function of 12 and 8? So now there's two calls to the function, and now you're going to print 40 twice, but you're going to let's see, this would print 40 and then 96, right? Because now x and y are going to be different things. So you're going to print the product twice, but you only print this difference. You only print x minus y once, because we only asked for the value of the function once. So hopefully that makes sense to you, and hopefully you can draw some distinction there. We can also assign a variable to the output of a function, and this works for any input to the function. Let me tell you what I mean by that. What we're going to do is we're going to say define another example of s and t, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to basically say print of 3 times s plus 2 times t, okay? And so clearly this would work. This would work if s and t are both ints and floats, or if one is an int and the other is a string, okay? And we already have seen that. It's either multiple concatenation or it's just simple arithmetic, right? And so now what you would do is basically what you could do is you could say basically referral equals another example, okay? And then basically you would go ahead and do, let's see, I think you have to put s and t at that point. Do you? No, I think you just do referral equals another example. So what this does is we assign a variable to refer to the output of the function for any value of x. So basically it replicates a function. So it creates a function called referral of s and t, which will work the same way as another example of s and t. Okay, so now what you can do, let's go ahead and try to call referral of 10 and 2, okay? And so we can see this is a print method, right? We don't set the result of referral equal to anything, but we just said that referral, you know, what referral is going to do is it's just going to get what another example would have returned. So now if you go ahead and run main.py, you would get 34, right? Because 3 times 10 plus 2 times 2 is 34. So this is basically an example of assigning a variable to refer to the output of a function for any value of x, right? And you would need to pass in the same number of inputs, right? So you need to pass in the same number of inputs in the same order as another example did, as the another example function did. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you, and hopefully that's clear to you with what's going on. Okay, so that's basically a lot of content, and then we also talked about docstrings. So I want to press on that for a little bit more. So basically, what we're going to do is we're going to say we already talked about multiple line comments once or twice, and we said that in Python we enclose a multiple line comment in between 3 pairs of double quotes, right? So ... comment, right? ... and that would be, or quote, right? So that would be an example, and then you could see how this comment would stretch onto multiple lines, right? So that wouldn't be a problem. So what we do is we say that docstrings are formal documentation for the functions and classes. We haven't gotten there yet, but we're going to talk about that we write in Python. Okay, so immediately after the function header, so the first line, the title, I guess, have a sentence that describes what the function does. Okay, make it clear, concise, and descriptive. Okay, you also need to specify 3 things, and we're only going to talk about 2 discussed in this video. Okay, any parameters or inputs to the function, and any return values. Okay, so we're going to basically give an example, but this is an example of a docstring, and we want people to understand what parameters and what return values, what inputs and outputs do we get in a function, and how exactly does it work. So what we're going to do is we're going to provide some docstrings for a couple of the functions we wrote in this video. What we're going to do is this function accepts 2, we could say 2 numbers, right? Presumably they're going to be numbers coming in here, prints their product, and returns their difference. Okay, so this would be an example of the first line of docstrings, right? It's a formal multiple line comment that's going to appear every time you scroll back over the function. So now one of the things we said in the previous video is now if I move the cursor over new function, it tells me this function accepts 2 new numbers, prints their product, and returns their difference. So hopefully that kind of makes sense to you, the difference between return. So now what you would do is you would want to specify any parameters that the function accepts. So here x, and then you could have a little description for it, a number, and then you could say y, another number, okay, and then basically you would say the returns. Okay, so you would return, and then basically x minus y, the difference between x and y. Okay, so basically this would be an example of a formal docstring. Okay, and then we can try to basically come up with another example, but it's going to be good for you to get into the practice of writing a docstring like this. Remember, when we scroll up, we say that you need to specify a description of the method. It's just immediately under the function header, and we said in the previous video that that's one of the differences between Python and Java, is that in Java you do see a sort of formal comment like this, but it actually would occur before the function header. But anyway, it just has the description, any inputs that come into the function, and any return types. So let's try to do it for this one. So this one doesn't return anything. So this one is an example of just a function that has parameters, but doesn't return anything. Okay, so what we would do is you would say this function accepts 2 inputs and returns, and prints either either an arithmetic expression or a multiple concatenation of the inputs or something like that. It doesn't really matter exactly what you write, but I wanted to just let you know how it works. So then the parameters here, you would say the parameters s, basically a number or string, and then you could say t is a number or string or something like that. And then here you would not specify returns, right? And then you could have another type of example where you only return something and you don't have any parameters. So what if you just said return 4? This is an example of a function that doesn't accept any inputs. And then here for the docstrings for here, you would be talking only about return values. So anyway, I want to do more docstrings. I think we're going to keep coming back to docstrings in all these videos and talking more about it, but I think that's enough for now. From you, Mozo3, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.